Well, let's get oriented. This is our orientation day. As a discursive formation, Orientalism facilitates and authorizes the practice of imperialism and colonialism through several interdependent fronts. Orientalism operates academically and scientifically, imaginatively and ideologically, militarily, politically, economically, culturally, religiously, and morally. Let's start with academically. So, academically, for example, anyone who studies or writes about or researches or teaches about the East, the Orient, from a wide range of academic fields. So, geography, history, sociology, anthropology, linguistics, even the harder sciences like biology or botany, even. So, like studying the weird and exotic flowers that only grow in the magical Orient. All of these scattered academic endeavors, these research projects, these knowledge producing initiatives undertaken by Western academics paint the East as the Orient. They construct this vision of the Orient as something whose destiny the West has a traditional entitlement over. So these academics construct the lens through which we see the East and treat the East. So there's no such thing as completely objective knowledge production. The research and reporting that goes into producing knowledge in any academic field, even the sciences, is inevitably done by human subjects with their own life experiences and biases and habitus and ingrained ways of looking at things and thinking about things. And the Western humans conducting research into the East during the 17th and 18th centuries and thus producing the East through its representations of the regions and its inhabitants are humans, after all, who have grown up hearing stories about the Orient from fellow Westerners and seeing and reading and hearing about all these representations of the East growing up in the West that they unwittingly and unconsciously reproduce when they reach the age to take on the academic task of understanding the Orient. They're going to go there with those biases and predisposition bundled up into their subjectivity so that what they see when they get there and what knowledge they produce pertaining to the East will largely reinforce and confirm the biases they already had. Like I said, a lot of it was completely unconscious. A lot of these academics traveling to the East during that period of several centuries didn't consciously have it in their heads that, oh, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to skew my research and reports to portray the East in a certain inferior way. They probably didn't have any vested personal interest in doing that. Like, that didn't benefit them personally, but it's ideologically built into the subconscious of the Westerner as they're studying the East. So that even when they do visit the East to see it for themselves, they're going to subconsciously confirm their bias by being on the lookout for the differences between the East and the West and emphasizing certain exotic things and attaching exaggerated meanings to them while de-emphasizing the more relatable and human things about the Eastern cultures that they're witnessing. So they end up distorting and producing or reproducing these caricatured ideas and representations of the Orientalized East, even if they're trying to be as neutral and objective and emotionally distanced from their object of study. These ingrained in unconscious biases from their upbringing in the West played a role in how they then represented the East through their academic work. Even the hardest of sciences, even the most seemingly objective and pure scientific pursuits were Orientalist. These scientists are still human, and they're humans from the West who have these subjective layers of knowledge and experience that have been built up for a long time, so that scientists who are genuinely trying to discover natural facts of the world and natural facts of the East are doing so based on their pre-existing knowledge that they believed to be natural facts, but were already socially constructed within their Western context, so that they're already predisposed to look at things and report on things in certain ways to produce more knowledge that confirms and solidifies what they already know or think they know about the East. So a lot of their knowledge is already based on stereotypes of the East, and they then unconsciously, unwittingly perpetuate those stereotypes in their scientific research, and they objectify it. They turn it into not just a subjective thing, not just someone's opinion, but now natural scientific facts. So we're not just talking about philosophers and economists and sociologists and political theorists. We're talking about biologists and chemists and physicists and medical doctors and mathematicians and engineers and zoologists and botanists who are all contributing to this subtly biased system of knowledge that produces and reinforces distorted misrepresentations of the East and its peoples. And it's this elite authority figure academic discourse that then trickles down into more commonly held discourses in the West, such as artistic and pop culture representations of the East by the West. So some of the most fictional stories are based on the knowledge that they think is true about the East, produced by scientists and academics. So the man on this slide was a British philologist and a linguist. And you know who else was a philologist and a linguist? Ferdinand de Saussure, our first theorist really covered in this course. And remember what I said about de Saussure, how he created linguistics to be this scientific pursuit of objective structural knowledge about the structures of languages. Well, this academic field that de Saussure created was later used for Orientalist purposes. This man who came on later in the field of linguistics, a famous British philologist and linguist named William Jones. He was really celebrated in Britain for his travels to Asia and Africa to research their language and report back on it back home. He was the first British person to get the chance to study Sanskrit, the Egyptian language, and Persian, the Iranian language. And he presented them as if they're these very mysterious and exotic things, like, ooh, they're so hard to understand, they're mysteries to be unraveled. Like, it really dehumanized the fact that these are real living languages used by real living people. Like, he made them seem like they were dead languages, like they were museum artifacts. And he also kind of lumped all those languages together. Like, he used de Saussure's notion that there's an underlying structure to all languages to say that all these Eastern languages, they're all pretty much the same. You can just lump Persian and Sanskrit together. And there was no one to challenge him on this. The Easterner couldn't speak for themselves or defend themselves. People in Britain just took this highly respected authority figure on the knowledge of language as the truth of the matter, as a true depiction of Eastern language and culture. Next, we have another important mechanism through which Orientalism and the Orientalist discourse operates, and that's imaginatively. So what do we mean by Orientalism operates through the imaginative sphere? We're talking about not just academic fields, not just non-fictional body of writing and discourse. We're talking about fictional literature in several genres, like fantasy literature and adventure novels and romance novels, that all contribute to producing a certain vision of the Orient and the subject position of the Oriental in the public consciousness. Not just, like I said, the high-ranking elite academic discourse is now a popular, common discourse in which these ideas are propagated. So it's not just academics and scientists who are contributing to Orientalist discourse, it's also poets and writers and novelists and painters and artists who depict the Orient as all of those stereotyped traits that associate the East with exoticness and mysticism and backwardness and antiquatedness and eroticism. You might be thinking, how does this kind of stuff affect the way we see people from the East? Like reading a clearly fictional story about how culturally backwards a place and its inhabitants are shouldn't allegedly affect your way of thinking about them or seeing them, because you consciously know that it's fiction. But if every single piece of fictional literature or art about the East, paints it and depicts it in a certain way, you're going to start thinking, even if subconsciously, that there must be some kernel of truth to it all. You're going to start thinking that, okay, some parts may be exaggerated here and there, but the implicit underlying basis for all these non-true stories must be true if all of their different sources are saying so. Even though you're consciously aware that you're watching something or reading something fictional that's exaggeratedly fantastical, subconsciously you become accustomed to the idea in your head and that signifier of the non-Western other and the signified meaning of cultural backwardness that becomes naturally associated with that signifier of the cultural other. And this signified relationship that's constructed in our heads related to the East facilitates the imperialist ideology that underlies Orientalist discourse. So someone back in the 17th or 18th century may have looked at that popular piece of art from the cover of the book Orientalism and think, okay, that seems a bit too magical to have a basis in reality, but then they go and read the popular story of Aladdin and the magic lamp and the portrayal of Middle Eastern culture there. And gradually they begin thinking that there's a lot of magic in that too. Surely that can't be a coincidence that magic is associated with the Middle East in all of these different sources. There must be some underlying truth that there is a mystical quality to the East, is what people begin to believe. A lot of these writers and poets and artists didn't have the luxury of visiting the East to see it firsthand and to base their works of art on their firsthand experiences. They had to use their imagination. Instead of physically traveling there, they had to imaginatively travel there and borrow from the distorted secondhand knowledge that others have written about the East, or the word of mouth they've received from others in the West, in order to produce and spread their own fantastical narratives and visions of the Orient without ever having traveled there or seen it for themselves. So the imaginative sphere includes art and painting and music. Think about the songs that are written or were written about the East, the wild tales spun in those songs about all the crazy adventures that travelers had when visiting the Orient. And even though stuff like that and fantasy and adventure and romance writing may seem frivolous and trivial and not legitimate, they still contribute subtly and implicitly to the Orientalist vision, because every single one of those fictional sources is pointing towards the same vision of the East in a very specific way. That's going to filter into public consciousness and the way everyone sees the East and the way the East sees themselves. So already the starting point, the jumping off point for a lot of academic and imaginative endeavors regarding the East are starting off on a biased point. They're building off previously introduced biased knowledge or fiction. And there's a relationship between the two. A lot of fiction is based on non-fictional academic work, and a lot of academic work is inspired by fiction. So like I said, any discourse, any discursive formation consists of an array of different texts varying in their nature and their origin. And Orientalist discourse is no different. There are so many radically different texts that still belong to this body of discourse that orientalizes Eastern places and subjects. So that it's not just layers of knowledge that are building upon each other consecutively and accumulating. It's layers of knowledge and then a few layers of fiction and fantasy built on top of that knowledge to reciprocally justify and rationalize that previous layer and use it as a justification for itself, and then upon which more knowledge is built. And upon that, more fiction and fantasy is built. And it all builds to form a comprehensive yet extremely skewed perception of the Orient and its peoples. Next, we have Orientalism taking a militarized form, and that's the more traditional conception of imperialism and colonization and physically imposing a manned and armed colonial administration over the East by Western imperializing powers. So this relates to military might and military presence in Eastern colonized countries. But Orientalism doesn't so much relate to the physical military presence, but the discursive construction of that military presence, the meanings that are associated with their presence in Eastern territories. So the discursive construction that it was necessary for British and French troops to occupy Eastern territories, and it was not only necessary, but it was warranted and something that the vulnerable foreign nations should be thankful for and grateful for, being protected by the powerful fatherly figure in the world order. So Orientalism, the discourse, didn't physically put these troops in that territory, but it justifies those troops being put in that territory and gives desirable meanings and associate those meanings with that presence so that it's accepted by not just the West, but the East as well. Orientalism also operates politically, and that's more traditionally imperialist, although operating on a bit more of a soft power level than militarily, which is a more hard power. But it still engages the East in direct political subjugation and exploitation through things like political treaties and various one-sided dealings between the West and the East. So in this painting, we have a bunch of British diplomats, and it looks like a bunch of Navy men too, with delegates from, it might be China or some sort of Asian country, and they're coming to the table to sign some sort of agreement. Probably some sort of vastly unfair and one-sided agreement that benefits the Westerners at the expense of the Easterners. And look at how many Western guys there are in this picture. I only see 3 guys that are likely to be from the Eastern country, or maybe 4, and then all the rest are clearly from the West. And these treaties often relate to land usage and territorial ownership. So you can think of all the political treaties and deals through which the Empire of Britain coerced a lot of indigenous peoples to give up valuable territory. And again, Orientalism as a discourse may not deal as much with the political agreements themselves, but it's the way the terms in the deal are constructed and framed exclusively by one party to the agreement, and the various consequences and norms and values that are then being accepted by the other party who is made and compelled to agree. And politically works hand in hand with economically. So we have the other deals regarding economic sanctions imposed on a colonized territory, or trade relations, often unfair trade relations where the empires are just extracting resources from periphery countries. So the image here shows some of the flows of resources, how all the raw materials go to England, and then all the manufactured goods and luxuries are then exported from there, in setting up all of these complex and intricate trade routes. So the political and the economic aspects work to establish and entrench that colonial relationship between the masters and the servants, or like I said, the haves and the have-nots, or the center of Europe and the imperialist powers, and the periphery, everything that's peripheral to that. And these softer modes of power allow Britain and imperialist powers to set up these relationships. Oh, my rice is ready. In more sustainable ways that renew themselves automatically and don't involve as much manual wielding of the power as is with a physical military occupation of a Western country's troops hanging around an Eastern region. That can be hard to and costly to maintain. But if you just set up a trade route, it kind of takes care of itself. It's a bit more hands-off. And those political and economic forms of power that the West wields on the East are further strengthened by culture and religious influences. So the spreading of not just Western political systems and economic ways of life, but the spreading of Western cultural values to the East, so that their values and cultural contexts are more in line with Western values and culture. It's a way of getting Eastern countries to act more like the West or in ways that benefit the West. So by imperializing a country's culture, they are more likely to then accept the domineering culture's political or economic or military presence. It's the same idea as when America wants to spread its influence around the world. It might not be looked upon well if they're sending their armies to physically occupy other countries. But if they get a few McDonald's and Starbucks within these countries and start promoting Western consumer values and start aligning those other cultures with the US in kind of a soft power way, then that'll open them up. It'll make them more pliable to Western control and manipulation in ways that don't require the signing or maintenance of formal political treaties or economic sanctions or military engagements. So culture is kind of like the path of least resistance when it comes to imperializing another country. You start with their culture. That's like the gateway that opens up for other forms of imperialism. If you infiltrate another country's culture, they're more likely to acquiesce to other forms of colonial impositions and restraints put on them. So this image is a McDonald's location, I believe, somewhere in Saudi Arabia. You can see a merging of American values into Saudi Arabian culture. So you can see on the menu, you see Big Macs, you see the fries, you see all the iconic menu items. They're even advertising a Happy Meal toy on the right side of the slide. But it's designed to cater to this local cultural context. So on the left side of the golden M, you have the English version of McDonald's, and then on the right side, you have in the Saudi Arabian language. And you can't see in this picture, but there's actually a separate till, a separate cash register for women to order. Just on the left of that big guy in the white t-shirt, there's like a divider for women to order their food separately. So this exemplifies the McDonaldization of the world, or the Disneyization of the world. It's imperialism by any other means. It's cultural imperialism. And then, of course, Orientalism also works religiously, the spreading of religious texts and the missionaries visiting and spreading the gospel of certain Western religions. If people in the East all adopt and adhere to Western religious tenets and Western defined morals, then they're going to act in ways that are conducive to the West wielding power over them. So like I said, I think on week 3, morals are socially constructed. They're ways of internally guiding our behavior. So that if you want to be seen and consider yourself a moral person, you need to do certain things and act in certain ways. And by injecting a sense of Western morality into the Easterner's psyche, it will help Westernize their conceptions and their actions. And the West is always assumed to have the moral high ground when it comes to the civilized Western way of life and the relatively uncivilized or barbaric or backwards way of life in the East, which gives the West a moral imperative and justification for intervening in and interfering with the affairs of the East on that moral pretense that it's the white man's burden to correct the Easterners' behavior and develop them into more civilized societies, according to the West's preconception of what it means to be civilized and morally upright. But morals are natural. It's not like the West is naturally more moral than the East. Morals are a social construction. They are the product of the cultural context in which they are circulated. They work for the functioning of a specific culture, but that doesn't mean that they can be universally applied to any culture. But that's what a lot of Orientalist discourse does. It associates the West with the universal, with the way things naturally should be across the board. And this moral justification is a good excuse for the West to interfere in and continue colonizing the East. They can use that as the reason for coming in the first place, to save the women and be the white knight and save all the vulnerable groups and children from the barbaric misogynist practices and of the cultures in the East. And then once they're there, hey, may as well set up some trade routes and some McDonald's and military outposts while we're here, while we're at it. So all this is done on the assumption that the East doesn't know what's best for them, that the West needs to tell them what's best for them. So the East is associated with a child in this discourse who doesn't possess the rationality to look after themselves, and the West is associated with an adult, a father figure, the one that needs to take care of the child that is the East and make sure they don't get into trouble or hurt themselves. So it's not only seen as a moral right in the West, a moral entitlement, it's a moral obligation. Like, oh, these people, they need to be saved. They don't know what's good for themselves. We wouldn't be good people as Westerners if we didn't try to do something to stop and intervene in what's happening over there. It operates on the idea that the East can't save themselves because they don't know what's wrong with themselves. It's up to the West in this discourse to save them and teach them and civilize them. The West is deemed to have that moral obligation to save the East from themselves and impose the West's own standards, their own arbitrarily set moral standards on these other cultures. So it's through Orientalism that the West judges the East according to the West's own set standards. It completely disregards the vastly different cultural context in which those moral standards are operating. And it's used through Orientalist discourse as the altruistic justification for all of these underhanded, ulterior motives of colonial imposition and administration. It's all operating on the assumption that the East is incapable, but they're discursively constructed to seem and be made incapable. Incapable of understanding themselves or studying themselves or governing themselves morally or politically or economically. It's all operating on the discursively constructed premise that the East needs the West and that the East is dependent on the West and they need to be taught by the West how to do things and live properly. And finally, this brings us to how Orientalism operates ideologically. So as I alluded to, any sort of Western scholar or scientist or poet or military official or missionary is dealing with the East under their own ideological constraints. So as I mentioned, it's not like these people are visiting the East with the conscious, deliberate intention to distort whatever they're representing about the East. Like the artist who painted this portrait of a scene in the East wasn't rubbing his palms together and thinking like, oh, I'm going to make up so much. I'm going to completely fabricate the fact that they're all flying around on magic carpets and are all naked and charming snakes and smoking opium and performing magic. The French artist who created this painting, which then became the cover for Edward Said's book on Orientalism, he traveled to the East and he probably didn't see scenes like this, even though clearly this painter belongs to the school of realism in his depiction. It's very realistic in terms of it. They look like it could have actually happened and he could have just painted a real life scene, but he just completely made this scene up in his artistic imagination. It's another imaginative contribution to Orientalist discourse. But the thing is, he didn't mean to paint them in a negative way. He genuinely appreciated the exotic and mysterious alleged nature of the Middle East. He thought he was complimenting that culture by painting it in this way. He had genuine admiration for the culture and didn't intentionally or consciously have ulterior motives, but the byproduct is paintings such as this that do distort and skew representations of Eastern cultures. This French painter grew up under the guise of Western ideology. It's so built into him, so imbued in the way he perceives and conceives things, that it's a pre-conscious, pre-existing bias that he puts into practice and executes over the East through his production of images such as this. The ideological underpinnings run so deeply through this discourse that even the people who perpetuate that discourse and produce knowledge and representations within that discourse are pre-consciously primed to look down upon the East without even realizing that they're doing so. And that's why it can be so insidious, because the way they approach it seems to be neutral and objective and well-intentioned. Like, oh, I'm just studying the East. or oh, I'm just writing a poem about the East or painting a portrait of the East. It all seems rather innocent. But then under that discursively constructed appearance of innocence, inherent to a lot of Orientalist discursive texts, we get to the crux of this discourse's ideology, which is the West deliberately engaging the East in a power relation where the West is in the superior position and the East is in an inferior position. Despite the tone of neutrality, they're still implicitly belittling and demeaning the East as an object of study, as opposed to just a place with people who are just as much people as those in the West. Instead, they were made to seem like this mysterious museum artifact, as opposed to a living, breathing culture. And like I said, each new generation of scholars and artists are building upon previous existing body of knowledge, so that even before this artist reached the East to see it for himself, even before they get there and choose what to look at and what to study and who to study and how to study it and how to approach it, their choices have already been limited and ideologically constrained by that existing Orientalist discourse, which serves to just reinforce and perpetuate itself and its own power over the East. So the Westerner views the East with a built-in tinted lens. Just like last week when I was using the analogy of lenses that we use to see fashion in different ways, this ideologically tinted lens emphasizes Orientalist stereotypes and de-emphasizes more humanizing elements in those Western scholars and artists' interpretation of what they're experiencing. And it's not just Westerners who come to believe it, but even the Easterners come to believe these ideas about themselves, as if what's been discursively constructed about them truly represents their nature, and as if that's truly all they're good for. Like I said, with the relationship between power, knowledge, and truth, truth is a thing of this world. It's produced by us and enforced on us. If Easterners begin to believe what's been said about them and written about them and depicted about them, and they start acting in line with this subject position that's been opened up for them by and through Orientalist discourse, then for all intents and purposes, it becomes true. It's a self-fulfilling destiny where Orientalist discourse puts the Easterner in a position of inferiority and then points to them being in that position as justification for continuing to put them in that inferior position. And of course, this whole relationship, this whole unequal binary power relationship has been concealed over centuries and naturalized. It's been made to seem natural, a natural disparity. That's where ideology is at work. It glosses over and conceals the human-made aspects of this discourse and hides the fact that it was made by humans over repeated attempts and efforts over time, over centuries of this Orientalist discourse being built up to the point where it seems natural and cohesive and makes sense to us from our subject positions in the West. And like I said, even to those in the East, even though it doesn't advantage them or benefit them, it disempowers them to see themselves that way. A final thing about this painting that we'll talk about a bit further in a few more slides is you can see a peak of an exposed buttocks there. And that's another aspect of Orientalist discourse. It depicts the East as not only exotic, but erotic. It's the sexualization of the Eastern subject and treating them as a sex object or a mere body that's ripe for being harvested and collected and used by the mind of the Westerner. Just as the Easterner's land is open to be harvested and taken, so is the Easterner's body. So for a long time, the East and people from Eastern regions were reduced to just like a harem of sexual indulgence and hedonism and pleasure and substance-induced spiritual journeys and wild trips, as opposed to the West, which is constructed on the other end of that binary of being associated with the mind as opposed to the body, and rationality and progress and modernity and all those positive notions.